Let's go. All right. Well, I have with me this brilliant panel. I'm going to be the moderator. Now, I'm not going to do much of anything. It started out that I was going to probably talk and share with these brothers, but I can't hang. I know when to sit down. So I was like, I'm going to let the two intellects hold this realm of ethical culture history. But this particular topic is called Ethical Culture's Foundational Assumptions, and this is the work of Dr. Terry L. Smith, who has been a member of the Washington Ethical Society, and of course, as you just recently met, the Reverend Dr. David Breeden, who has also been part of the Humanist Institute as well at the AHA. I think that these are these two gentlemen, as I have met them before and prior. Terry, we've crossed paths a few times. I have to say, it's really interesting to hear and listen to y'all tango, especially over email. Anytime you can see a dissertation of emails, please be alerted, okay? I was reading dissertations and I said, yeah, let me just take a seat. I'm gonna let y'all do this wealth of wisdom today. So I just want y'all to do a really quick introduction. If there's anything I've forgotten, I'm gonna start over here, Terry, with you, and then I'm gonna move over to you, David, and there's the mic in the center.
Here we go. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. And this is really the audience that I've wanted to talk to, and now after David explained this building, this is the place I want to talk about the foundations of ethical culture. And I've been a member at the Washington Ethical Society since 1979, but this is my first assembly. I probably should explain a little bit about myself. Because most of you wouldn't know me. I do have a degree in philosophy, but it's in philosophy of science and mathematical logic, not ethics or theology. So I'm a little bit outside my expertise, and I taught for 22 years, and then I went over to the dark side and became a dean for 16 years. Yeah. Me too. And then after that, I retired in 2013 and tried to get back into the mode of research again and wrote a few articles about behavioral psychology, and then decided I don't have anything more to say about that. And so I started reading about ethics, and that led to ethical culture, and that led to what I want to talk about today.
Awesome. David.
David Breeden. I too grew up Pentecostal down by the Ohio River. I still own a family farm in deep southern Illinois. Those of you who are from the St. Louis area know that's where the hillbillies come from. I call myself a toothless hillbilly because that's what I am, and I'm proud of it. I went to Southern Illinois University, which got a minor in philosophy there. It's the center of pragmatist thought. John Dewey's papers are there, as a matter of fact, in the archives. So very much in the pragmatic mode of philosophy. I was first an English professor. My first degree, my PhD was in Old and Middle English, which has nothing to do with that. But I also, when I went to SIU, I didn't want to be a Pentecostal anymore. I saw through it, if you will. Many of you have had that faith journey. I went to a small Unitarian Universalist Humanist fellowship at the university. And I never stopped doing that as a layperson. So I've been a humanist since 1978. But in the Unitarian Universalist side of things. So that's how I sort of got here. I retired after 20 years. And yes, we all get promoted to our level of incompetence, and I was eventually a dean before I retired. And then I retired and went to Meadville Lombard in Chicago, one of the two UU seminaries, and got an MDiv. So I have 3 terminal degrees, but I ain't dead yet. So, this is one of my passions, and one of the reasons that I retired And I'm writing a book on transcendentalism, which is sort of the first mode of how this is all going to spin out eventually. So, and that's what I'm looking into right now. So that's me.
Awesome. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Terry, because I understand we have a presentation. The rest of you, I want y'all to get your notebooks out because you're about to get learned, as we say.
Take it away?
Yeah,
Okay.
you can actually take it away, sir.
So one of the fundamental principles of my life is if technology can go wrong, it will. So I sent my PowerPoint here, but it wasn't received. So what we have, I hope, is just the PDF which I shared, but not the PowerPoint itself. So, so I'm going to talk about what I discovered when I did some reading about ethical culture. And let's go to the next slide. Any discussion of ethical culture has to start with Felix Adler. And my discussion today is framed by an article that was written in 1988 by Marcus Singer, who taught philosophy at the University of Wisconsin. And actually, I knew him just by coincidence. I played tennis with him. And I also took a class from him on Kant's ethics. But I didn't know about this article until just a few years ago. But he was asked by the editors of the Journal of Humanism and Ethical Religion, which basically I believe is edited or was edited by the leaders of the ethical culture movement. He was asked to assess Adler's influence on American philosophy. And he was well qualified to do that because he taught and wrote about ethics, but he also taught and wrote about American philosophy. So, he represented the intersection of those two subjects. And his conclusion after looking into Adler's influence was that he had no influence on American philosophy. But then he also asked, is there an area where he should have had influence? And his answer was yes, he should have had influence on applied ethics. And so shortly after he published that article, the discipline of applied ethics discovered Adler. And we can go to the next slide if it's available. And what they found was that the foundational assumptions that ethical culture is based on are very similar to those of applied ethics, and Adler's ideas were original and valuable. So these are ideas that were written about by Adler and early ethical culturists from 1876 to 1896. 86 was when, the Standard Hall address was given that usually is dated as the beginning of the ethical culture movement. And by 1896, ethical culture and the ethical movement had spread to Europe, and that was the date of the first international meeting that was held in Zurich. So the influence of the movement had spread very quickly. So Adler's ideas, and if we could go to the next slide, were published mainly in two periodicals. The Ethical Record, which was founded in 1888 and was written by members of the ethical movement and mainly for members of the ethical movement. And then in 1890, Adler, as well as some of the other leaders of ethical culture and some other people who were interested in the ethical movement, founded a journal called the International Journal of Ethics. And this was an academic journal that aspired to high intellectual standards. And its goal was to advance knowledge and practice of ethics. In 1923, the journal started being edited or published by the University of Chicago Press, and it shortened its name to Ethics. And it still exists. You can check it out. They receive about 500 submissions per year, and they publish about 24 of them. So it's a very selective journal. It's very influential. It's probably among the, 5 or 10 most influential philosophy journals today. So Adler's briefest and most emphatic statement about the foundations of ethical culture were published in that journal in 1894. If we can go on to the next slide. Frederick Harrison, who was a positivist, had written an article, published an article in the International Journal of Ethics, in which he said that no ethical culture can determine conduct unless by alliance with religion and philosophy. In other words, if a movement doesn't share religious and philosophical assumptions, it can't succeed. And Adler wrote a reply in the same issue. We can move on to the next slide. And he said, if there's anything new in the ethical movement, it is its dissent from this widely accepted view. Now, it's probably no surprise that Adler didn't think that ethical culture is based on shared religious ideas. I mean, our motto is diversity in the creed, unity in the deed, so you'd expect that. But he was also saying it's not based upon shared philosophical assumptions either. And what did he mean by that? He meant it's not based on answers to ultimate questions, the kind of questions that philosophers are constantly focusing on and almost never coming to agreement upon. So this presumably applies to, or at least I assume that applies to Adler's own philosophy. So in 1819, he wrote an ethical philosophy of life in which he tried to answer some of the ultimate questions of ethics and philosophy. And if you read the introduction to that, he says, this is just my opinion. He's not offering that as a definitive statement of ethical culture. And I take him at his word. If we can move on to the next one. So Adler, in Volume 1, Number 1 of the International Journal of Ethics, wrote an article on the freedom of ethical fellowship in which he tried to explain what ethical culture was about. And he explained the goals of an ethical society as being to gain clearer perception of right and wrong, to study the practical problems of ethics, and to incorporate those insights into manners and institutions. Can go on to the next slide. So to attain these goals, ethical culture, as he explained it, relies upon a novel method. And the method distinguishes between what he calls the primary and the secondary principles of ethics. And he gives 3 examples of what he means by primary principles. And these are not the kinds of ideas that he says ethical culture is based on. One primary principle is the utilitarian principle, that we ought to do whatever results in the greatest happiness of the greatest number. A very widely discussed philosophy, but also, as with any philosophy, a controversial one. Another example is the Kantian principle, that the maxims of our actions should never contain a self-contradiction. Another very influential philosophy, but also controversial. And a third primary principle is the Christian principle that we should always act out of love. All 3 of these, he says, are primary principles. They're not what ethical culture is based on. Then he gives an example of a secondary principle, and these are the kind of principles that he says form the bond that unites members of an ethical culture society. And he gives this example of the golden rule, which is, do unto others as you would that others do unto you. Now, he says that by no means constitutes the whole of ethics, and it furthermore has some limitations. But it's useful because it offers practical guidance in some challenging situations. And it furthermore receives support from the various primary principles. But he says it's more certain than any of the primary principles, which are themselves each controversial in their own ways, whereas there's virtually a consensus among ethical philosophers that the golden rule is a valuable principle to follow. So he says secondary principles of this kind are what unite members of an ethical society. Go on to the next slide. So does ethical culture suffer from the absence of agreement among members on ultimate or primary principles? Adler thinks not. In fact, he says, well, the goal of ethical culture is action. But the general formulas of philosophy and religion fail to answer the specific practical questions that ethical action poses. And so, in fact, in one of his articles, he says that those principles, those abstract principles of philosophy and religion, can blind us to the facts of ethics and what is appropriate in a specific situation. The next slide. In fact, he argues that knowledge of ethics moves in the opposite direction, that it starts with action, then the facts discerned through ethical experience are more certain even than these secondary principles that he said should bind us. So the most certain facts are when we act and we have an experience of whether that action was right or wrong. We often are uncertain at the time, but then in reflection we realize, was that the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? Those are the facts that are the most certain as a foundation of ethics. And then we use those to modify or even to eliminate some of our secondary principles. And I think this is one of the interesting things about what Adler had to say about the foundations of ethical culture, because some of his secondary principles having to do with his skepticism about feminism, his ideas of the traditional family and so forth, I think most of us would say, no, we don't adopt those today. But he gave a basis for moving on, which is our experience of the consequences of our actions. And so, this is something that I think as Americans we're familiar with, which is we're familiar with founding ideas that are actually valid ideas, but the founders themselves were not able to live out the full meaning of those ideas. And so each generation has a responsibility of deepening and refining those ideas. And so I think, you find in those founding ideas of ethical culture a justification for moving beyond some of the specific principles that Adler advocated in his practical ethics. So, returning to Singer's 1988 article, and we can go to the next slide here. He was asked by the editors to assess Adler's influence on American philosophy. And the answer was, as of 1988, none. If he'd been asked to assess Adler's influence on European philosophy, he'd have gotten he'd have arrived at a different conclusion. Henry Sidgwick, probably, how many people here have heard of Henry Sidgwick? A few people. Great, okay. Henry Sidgwick wrote what some very influential contemporary philosophers, including Derek Parfit, I don't know if that name means anything, but he's a very widely respected contemporary philosopher of ethics. Peter Singer, who started the animal liberation movement, and is also probably somebody that, how many people have heard of Peter Singer? Not a lot, okay, a few. Anyway, both of those people think that Sidgwick wrote what is still the most important book on ethics, which he published in 1874. So Sidgwick was very interested in Adler's ideas. And let me just say a little bit about how Adler's ideas connected with Sidgwick's. Sidgwick wrote a book called Methods of Ethics. And in that book, he distinguishes between a normative theory of ethics and a method of ethics. A normative theory of ethics tells you ultimately what is the reason why something is right or wrong. So utilitarianism, for example, says the right thing to do is the thing that would have the best consequences for the largest number of people. Well, unfortunately, that often can't be known. So as a practical guide, utilitarianism has its limitations. Now, a method of ethics is a principle or a practice that gives guidance in a practical way, even under circumstances of lack of certainty. So Sidgwick asks, well, what is the best method of ethics? And his answer is, there is no certainty as to what is the best method of ethics. Actually, there's no principled basis for saying what is the best method of ethics. However, he seems to have concluded that Adler had articulated a method that was very valuable because Sidgwick devoted the last 10 years of his life to furthering the ethical movement in England. He started the Cambridge Society for Ethical Culture. He published the first article of the first volume of the International Journal of Ethics. Adler didn't. He gave priority to Sidgwick. He invited Sidgwick to have the lead article for the new journal. He hosted Adler when he came to Cambridge in 1892. He was president of the London Ethical Society in 1893, and he delivered numerous addresses to ethical societies in England and gathered them together in a book called Practical Ethics, which was the last book he published during his lifetime. Yes?
I stop at 10:30.
Okay.
So, yep.
Yeah,
And I got to get the
getting close
audience.
to the end.
We want to get our audience in here too as well.
yeah.
Thank you.
So Sidgwick follows Adler in describing the method of an ethical society as based on the spontaneous, unreflected judgments on particular cases of those persons to be found in all walks and stations of life, whose earnest and predominant aim is to do their duty. And these are the judgments that he felt provide the basis for a method of ethics that maybe would not be the definitive method, but would be a valuable method of ethics. Now, more than 100 years later, just moving toward the end here, to document some of the appreciation of applied ethics for Adler, Piers Norris Turner, writing in the journal Ethics, credits Adler with the following insight: shared ethical values can be explored and have social authority independent of the truth of any controversial philosophical assumptions. Next slide. Turner furthermore says that Adler founded, that the journal Adler founded continues to pursue its aim of establishing a public morality that respects well-intentioned individuals holding a diversity of philosophical and religious commitments. That's what ethics has as their editorial standard. And moving to the next slide. Heinrichs. Do we have Heinrichs up here? No, next slide. Yes. Bert Heinrichs in 2018 publishes an article in the Philosophical History of Philosophy Quarterly, in which he gives Adler credit for being the founder of applied ethics. And what he means by that is, by modern applied ethics, he distinguishes traditional applied ethics, tried to take these primary principles of ethics and apply them to specific situations. Modern applied ethics is not based on primary principles of ethics, but on these intermediate principles, the same kind of thing that Adler was talking about over 100 years ago. And so just briefly summarizing the ideas then, that these are not my ideas, these are actually the ideas of philosophers of ethics, which I found when I read the literature. Applied ethics can proceed without appealing to ultimate or primary principles, and it can build upon the ethical judgments of ordinary people of goodwill from all walks of life. And finally, I have an annotated bibliography, which I believe we have available to hand out. And that would give you the opportunity to read some of the articles that I've referred to and check my conclusions. I'm going to hand over the mic now to David.
Thank you. Well, as I see it, I have two things to talk about. One is the history of Unitarianism, very quickly, and then some things about this building. Unitarianism is directly a descendant of the Puritan ideas, Calvinism, that came to the U.S. in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. When they moved over here, the Puritans assumed they were going back to England to take over the government. But that never happened, and so these Puritans stayed in this country. What they did when they came is Massachusetts Bay was a corporation, not a colony. Most people don't know that. It had articles of incorporation from the King of England. Now, the Puritans weren't quite as pure as you might think. One of the ministers stole the charter and brought it to the U.S. so that the king couldn't use it. And that's the beginning of the rebellious ways. When they got here, they had congregational polity. That meant that every congregation actually made its own decisions. That's still true today. I have retired. The next minister will be chosen after a year of interim and looking at people, and it is the people of the congregation who choose who will be the next minister. That becomes very important because what are the people in this congregation going to ask for? A humanist, right? They're not going to get a Christian minister. That's just not what they're going to do. That's how Unitarian congregations have preserved what they do. Those of you from the East Coast probably know a very Christian Unitarian Universalism today. That's because, of course, Unitarianism started out as a congregational Christianity. Then they split into two, the Unitarians and the Trinitarians, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. That was called congregational. You still see that term some nowadays, but mostly nowadays it's the United Church of Christ, which is the most liberal Christian group, and the Unitarian Universalists are a very liberal group, but still a kind of umbrella organization with all kinds of, paying attention to all kinds of religions, in other words. So that's where it comes from. Now, John Harvard was a Puritan, one of the first to arrive in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a brewer. So what does a brewer do? They start a college, right? John Harvard founded Harvard, and right across from the Harvard Green was his brew pub, where he was selling the students alcohol. So that was pretty smart. If I ever start a college, I'm going to go do that exactly as well. At that time, Harvard College was built to turn out ministers in the congregational tradition, the Puritan. Slowly, the Unitarians took over Harvard, and eventually Harvard was a Unitarian theological school. Now it's not. They have disaffiliated. We now have two, Meadville Lombard in Chicago and Starking out in California, in Berkeley. So those are the two different ones that we have nowadays in terms of seminaries. But that's kind of how this happened. Now, within this congregational framework, which is centered in Boston, it still is, you're going to have these weird things happening if you have congregational polity. Ralph Waldo Emerson becomes a Unitarian minister. He doesn't like it. He doesn't believe that he should do anything with sacraments, for example, and eventually he quits. He quits being a minister. He's sort of still a Unitarian, but he becomes a transcendentalist. Now, what's transcendentalism? Transcendentalism is the idea from Kant that we can intuit our ethics, our morality. Now, Kant argues this, but most people didn't take him up on it as far as the implication goes. He writes another book about religion, And that one says we don't need it. And the Prussian king says, dude, never talk about religion again. And so Kant says, you're right, I'm really sorry about that, but it did get out. Now, one of the things that comes directly from that is you have Kant, and then you have a whole bunch of German idealists, and eventually you have a fellow by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach. Now, most people have not heard of Ludwig Feuerbach. Again, yep, all right, some people have, yes, all right. Well, there were two German idealists who come to this country, their ideas come to this country. Number one was Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher says that we need to keep Christian religion going, it's good for the people, and we will just adapt, we'll get as liberal as we need to do, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what most Unitarian Universalist congregations do today, still yet. A generation after Schleiermacher was Ludwig Feuerbach, and he wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity. What's the essence of Christianity? The essence of Christianity is that religion is anthropology. Religion equals anthropology. In other words, all this religion business is just in people's heads. It's historically created by human beings. He is considered by me, and I think some other people, as being the founder of the humanist idea, because the God is just in our heads. Kant had said this before, morality is just in our heads, right? It comes from our gut. We can sense it. We know what's right or wrong. Mm-hmm. The Sidgwick connection is very important because that's Cambridge University. Cambridge University is the one that after the Second World War, the women took over essentially the philosophy department, and you have probably heard of the trolley problem. That comes directly from the women of Cambridge University who are saying, wait a minute, we think morality is intuitive. And what they did then, and this is still going on even though these women are long dead, they've gone all over the world changing the trolley problem to some extent to meet social needs of different peoples. But what they've proven is that everybody in the world, all human beings, more or less, have the same morality. As you know, the trolley problem is one person is over here on a track, 3 people are over here on a track, you must decide to switch the track. Are you going to kill 1 person or 3? Almost everyone says, yes, kill 3 people. Almost everybody. And again, I'm not questioning morality, but almost everybody says that. The one is, however, you've got a person who comes in who needs a liver transplant. You've got 3 people in the hospital over here. Why don't you just take a liver out of one of them and fix this other person? Almost no one says that's okay, to kill a relatively healthy person to transplant a liver into another person. It just seems wrong. And that's what the interesting thing about it. Even philosophers, if you keep pushing, why do you think that? Why do you think that? They'll eventually say, I don't know, I just know it's wrong. Right? And so Kant was correct in this regard, we now know, and it's because of evolution. But Kant is writing previous to the real Darwinian understanding of evolution. And so that's how that gets into our little movement. A very fascinating book is called An Emancipation of the Mind. Mm-hmm. By Stewart. Has anyone read this yet? You've got to read this book. It's about how abolitionism grew in the U.S. Abolition had already wiped out slavery in Great Britain. The abolitionists can't come over here, and they think they're going to destroy the institution of slavery in the 1820s and 30s. It doesn't work. Why? Because the American Protestant fundamentalists, which were most Americans at that time, well, the Bible says slavery's just fine. It just does, right? So how are you going to get around the problem that God says slavery's a good idea? Well, the only way to do it is to go back to Kant and transcendentalism and to Feuerbach, who says religion is anthropology. And this book discusses that, Emancipation of the Mind. Frederick Douglass was a big reader of this book, The Essence of Christianity. It came out in 1850 in the U.S. in an English translation by George Eliot. Who knows who George Eliot is? A woman, a woman Unitarian in Great Britain who was trying to, well, especially feminist issues. She calls herself George Eliot because she wants to be taken seriously as a novelist, not as a female novelist. And she did the first translation into English, and Frederick Douglass, a Unitarian by the name of Theodore Parker, who was one of the big leaders in Boston of the abolitionist movement, and Abraham Lincoln also read it. And he, in his early days, before Lincoln learned how to put shade on his act, he was very much a free thinker, and had been reading this kind of material. And again, this book says very explicitly, religion is anthropology. And so you're going to get a Theodore Parker who was a Unitarian minister preaching in Boston at the time. You're going to have him say, you know what? Religion is history. It's historical. It moves with time. And guess what, people? Ask your gut. Is enslaving Africans okay? No, it's not. Even if the Christians say it's okay, it ain't okay. And so that's the way. And so Frederick Douglass, then Theodore Parker dies right before the war. Now, Frederick Douglass was a star of his day, as you probably know, and he joins Ralph Waldo Emerson in a group called the Free Religious Association, the FRA. Who else was a member? Felix Adler, exactly. And so this is formed in 1867, just after the war, and it's a group of people who are post-Christian. Would be, I think, the best way to say that, post-Christian. And so some of them are, Christian, but a lot of them are going to go to Feuerbach and say, wait a minute, is there a God? Because why would we need a God to have the basis of our ethics? Because humanity itself has the basis for our ethics right in our minds. We're born with it. We get it transcendentally. We get it by looking around us and seeing the nature of reality. Of course, in those days, they weren't environmentalists, for example, but is John Muir going to become some kind of humanistic person? Absolutely, because he's going to say, God said, tear down the woods, subdue the earth and all this stuff. But later they're going to say, wait a minute, why are we doing that? And that's going to go back to Spinoza, that many of you know, who said it's either God or nature. You call it what you want, right? And so Spinozans become a thing to call people after the Civil War. And the Free Religious Association is basically a bunch of Spinozans. Now, one of the heroes, one of the main leaders of this, because Ralph Waldo Emerson, as you may or may not know, died in dementia. So he was slowly losing it after the Civil War. So a guy by the name of O.B. Frothingham was a Unitarian minister. His father was a Unitarian minister who hated the Transcendentalists. Frothingham goes to Harvard. He's 10 years too young to be one of the inner circle of the Transcendentalists, but he absolutely admires them. And he becomes a Unitarian minister and is called to Third Church, Third Unitarian in New York City. You haven't heard of it because there isn't one, because he dropped out of the Unitarian group, the UUA as it's called nowadays, and became an independent humanist congregation. And he was friends with Felix Adler. So here they are in this Free Religious Association. All they do actually, though, is argue all the time. And so Adler says, forget you guys, I'm going to go do this by myself. You're just not doing anything except arguing. We all know that from the history of the American socialist and communist parties in the U.S. too. You just keep throwing people off the boat because they're not pure enough, and eventually no one's in the boat anymore, right? But so eventually it does run out. Frothingham gets ill and becomes a writer after he leaves the congregation, and that congregation then died. A lot of that happens, a lot of that goes on. The book that you really need to see about this, and I put this in slides, but I decided not to bother, but it's The Church of St. Thomas Paine, okay, A Religious History of American Secularism by Lee Eric Schmidt. Has anyone read this book? You got to read, if you have any interest in how all of this happened, you've got to read this book, The Church of St. Thomas Paine. Now, what happened is Thomas Paine, remember, was one of the founding white guys, back during the American Revolution. After the Revolution, he writes a book called The Age of Reason. The Age of Reason declares a deistic God, at best. At best. And then he goes over and joins the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. After the Constitution was signed, the founding white guys who decide they really need to be more Christian about it, a lot of pressure there, decide they're going to ostracize Paine. Paine was essentially removed, and most people don't know how central to the American Revolution he was, even today. His bust has been paid for by various groups of humanistic type people over time, and those always get taken back down. He's not in the pantheon, and still isn't. And so this book talks about how Thomas Paine was ostracized, removed, and then picked up by people who were interested in secularism in the 19th century. And that's how all of this, again, fits together in a way. And it also then talks about the 19th century groups that are going to try to form congregations. And that's the central question. Oh, you did put it up. Thank you. The Church of St. Thomas Paine. I mean, Paine is interesting because, his bones disappeared. Just like other people we know in myth. And they still don't really know where it is. They thought they had found his grave at one point here in the U.S., but it was actually the grave of a guy who was a great admirer, who said that, who said, Thomas Paine, my hero, and then had his name in little bitty letters after. So we don't even know where. Some people think a finger bone was found in Australia. I mean, it's very weird, and that's why he calls it the Church of St. Thomas Paine, because of these kind of odd things of trying to find his bones. Well, why do secular people have any interest in somebody's bones, right? It's just, we're not going to sell them, 24 foot to the Pilgrims or something. But so anyway, this is a wonderful book to look at. Since you got it up, a flash on the next one then, or can you do that, or do I have to do that? I maybe have to do that. Okay, this is Transcendentalism in New England by Octavius Brooks Frothingham. It's on Project Gutenberg. It's free, and it's not bad as a book. He was a very good writer. The next one, I think, is the one I just mentioned. I take dust jackets off my book. Oh, yeah, that Lee Eric Schmidt also wrote something called Village Atheists, How America's Unbelievers Made Their Way in a Godly Nation. And I mean, people spent time in prison over this. I'll get back to that in a moment. And his biggest kind of overview is Restless Souls, The Making of American Spirituality. And so he's written all three of those books. He's supposed to write one about early 20th century soon, which I'm looking forward to because that would be the era of this church. Now, let me flip over to this church very quickly to fit all this together. During the 19th century, there was something called the Liberal League. The Liberal League was formed to fight the Comstock laws. You've heard of the Comstock laws. Comstock was a real Puritan, at least in his thinking, and he went after the U.S. mail. The U.S. mail, up until his time, was completely open. You could send anything. As a matter of fact, during the Civil War, most of the things that were going to the military was pornography, as you might expect. So he's going to shut down pornography. Well, what's pornography? Well, atheism is pornography, right? Birth control is pornography, all right? Free love, ways of enjoying sex, all pornography. All right, well, and so he starts, closes all that down. The Liberal League fought that. Guess what? They lost. And the Comstock laws clamped down, and especially women spent time in jail for sending various kinds of birth control and sex information, which was verboten. No way you can do that. Okay, so the Liberal League in the city of Minneapolis has lost their battle. What do? They formed a Darwin reading group in the 1870s. Remember that Charles Darwin's book comes out in 1859, and it's not what you're going to read on Saturday night unless you know a whole lot about biology. So they form a group here in the Twin Cities, not on this site. They were downtown at that time. They really got into Darwin, and so they hired a speaker to come up here from the University of Wisconsin, and he was a professor there, but he was also a Unitarian minister, which they didn't even know. And he comes up here and he impresses everybody with his presentations on Darwin. Guess what? They say, dude, we want you to be our leader. He said, no problem, except I'm a Unitarian minister, so you have to form a Unitarian congregation. So that's how this particular congregation was formed. He already was an agnostic. The first two, and this was 1881 when this was formed, again, not on this site. So the first two ministers both were very openly agnostic, which was kind of forbidden but kind of not among Unitarians. That's how this congregation goes for a while. In 1916, they hire a guy by the name of John Dietrich. John Dietrich had been tried for heresy as a Christian minister. He became a Unitarian, and then he became a humanist by reading materials, the Holyoke materials from the secular humanists in Great Britain. And so he forms this group here as a humanist congregation, and so the people called him, again, Congregational Polity, and so this becomes the first explicitly humanist congregation in the United States. In the world, actually. And here we're still going since 1881. We have been explicitly humanist since 1916, and we were really part of that FRA kind of movement. Unitarian ministers couldn't say they were atheists until John Dietrich came along, and his partner in crime, who was in Iowa, Curtis Reese. You may know Curtis Reese, also a Unitarian minister. He goes on to become the first president of the American Humanist Association. Curtis Reese was much more of a institution builder, but much less of a minister. He didn't like congregational life very much as a minister. He wanted to be a thinking person, basically. And so the AHA is formed right out of that after the Second World War. So that's how all of this begins to fit together. So the word humanism was already in place somewhat, mostly humanitarian in the 19th century, humanist in the early 20th century after 1916, and then the first Humanist Manifesto is signed in 1933, and the rest is history. And Dietrich and Reese had to fight the whole time this idea that humanism equaled atheism. Neither of them ever claimed to be an atheist, by the way. They were both epistemological philosophers who said, we just can't know. How are we going to know? We're animals that evolved on the savannas of Africa. How would we ever know? And so that's where they left it. That's where I leave it as well. I just, how would I know? And most of the people here call themselves apatheists, by the way, not atheists, but apatheists. They just don't care. And I would say that's probably a fairly good way of thinking about it. And as you know also, Adler never claimed to be an atheist. He just simply believed that that Christianity would disappear with time. Neither of them were right about that, and so here we are today. And the question I would ask and pose to you all, I've asked myself many times. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, the only true religion is a religion of one. Your subjective reality is the only religion that you can truly have. I believe that, I believe that the Protestant Reformation set that up. Where does congregating come in? And that's the question I want to leave you with, and then let's take questions from the floor.
Yeah. So to our Zoom community, please prepare yourself questions. I was hoping to ask questions, but see, I'm a smart person. I know there's very little room when you have good, brilliant brains in the room. And definitely, David, we're both Pentecostal. We know how to be long-winded. So I know better. I guess we can start with that question, David, to our audience. I'm also going to ask that if you can, please formulate a question. I know we like to go on a little bit longer, but we literally have 25 minutes. So I want to make sure that everybody gets their questions out. And I also want to hold space because if I can be real for a second, it's great when we have a great sense of intellectual grandeur. That is beautiful. But also I like to make sure that we have room for those who do not engage that way. Because it is a very particular it is a particular kind of train of thought. So I want to also hold space for also those questions that we would not think of in this space. We have spent a lot of time doing philosophy, but I like to go a little bit to the ground level where the people are. Ideas are great, but people come before ideas. So please do not hold back. So do we have anybody on Zoom first before I go into the audience? We don't? Great. All right. So if there's a question within the audience, Hugh Taft Morales. Can I borrow that mic? Yep. I'm going to get my love walking shoes on, so we good.
You get two philosophers on stage and you can't keep me from running up here afterwards. So my question is, David, your last statement really get my mind going because I'm an existentialist. I believe that you said, that the subjective reality is the only reality we have. And I went into ethical culture because I wanted transcendence. Yep. And the only transcendence I've ever experienced in my life that feels real, it doesn't feel like somebody is trying to do something over me or con me or whatever, is the transcendence I have in growth of my personal relationships, where who I am grows and becomes different because I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a member of an ethical culture society. So for both of you, I want to know whether or not you would describe that experience as transcendence.
I don't know that I can answer Hugh's question, but I do have something to say about your question of what is the point of a congregation or what is the point of gathering with others. And I do think that these founding ideas that I talked about that Adler had give an answer. It may not be the right answer, but at least gives an answer. And that is, if experience is the ultimate basis for ethics, you can broaden your experience by being in relationship with others. And the more diverse that group of others is, the sounder the basis for your ethics. So I think there is, in these founding ideas, a rationale for reaching out beyond straight white male culture, having a broader range of experience as the basis for the bonds that tie us together.
Yeah, I now have a microphone. That's what I see as the aggregate effect as well. This congregation welcomed Margaret Sanger. Again, she was literally chased across the Mississippi River Bridge from St. Paul, which is more Catholic, across and sought refuge in our old building downtown there. She was banned from speaking at all publicly. She had a gag order. She could not talk about anything about birth control. The only place in the nation she could speak was the Unitarian pulpit, which is considered a free pulpit. So she was invited by the women of this congregation. We formed Planned Parenthood, this congregation. I'm no longer part of it. They formed Planned Parenthood there, and as you may know, Minnesota is one of the most liberal of the women's choice states, and abortions here are still perfectly legal. We even won, this congregation joined in a lawsuit against having fetal remains. There was a law that we had to have a funeral for fetal remains no matter how old, which is just silly, right? And we joined in with that. So we're still fighting it, but it goes all the way back, and it's part of our tradition here. That's how we do it. They were able to do it because they were aggregates. Right? They were people who joined together to effect change. So that's one thing. The other thing is normative. I always say anything you got, any medical thing you got this week, we mentioned it in what we call Joys and Sorrows, it's corporate and that sort of thing. And you know what? Whatever you got, someone in here survived. I can promise you. But we have about 130 people usually on Sunday morning. We've got a guy who's lived for 3 years with pancreatic cancer. So, you know, when I hear pancreatic cancer, I think dead within 2 weeks. He's lived 3 years. He's eaten twice. You know, so that's one thing a congregation can do, I think, is normalize even the worst sorts of things. And also, yeah, you know, I think, well, again, Pentecostalism, we create the transcendence as Pentecostals, but, you know, and the formula is real simple, right? You just got to get that music pumping up above the heart rate level, you know, right? And suddenly you're in a dance mode, and, you know, and so that can be, I mean, people ask me, how can you have a congregation without God? Well, I say all congregations are without God. Some know it and some don't. So we know.
Thank you for that, y'all. And if I may also reply to you, Hugh, I think it is in the reconstruction of the spiritual ideals where Adler goes around, I think it's like page 63 in one of the kind of the beige-looking copies, where he spends a lot of time talking about, we get to that part where he's talking about eliciting, but he's very clear about, he actually uses a Christian example talking about Christ. He goes really deep into it. And in that moment, he begins to talk about this transcendent application between even just the life cycle. And that life cycle is very much so within the particularly ethical culture's idea here, is that the life cycle is transcendent. If we do not have that, we have not experienced interconnectedness. Therefore, if no one is experiencing life in its most ideal way, then one of the things that we struggle with, we miss out on the interconnected relationships that we are supposed to have. And so I think that is, you know, whether, you know, we can call these moments of life maybe stations, if you will, modes of meaning. To be a father is a different meaning than to be a husband. But I think where we are seeing time shift now, even with titles, we are seeing that people are moving from modes of meaning to modes of matter. What has matter, right? Because anybody can be somebody's daddy, but that doesn't mean that they are a father, right? And so when we see that happening today, I think this is when we we can actually apply a transcendent ethic, and we can begin to see how ethics can also be queered, if you will. And when we think about people like Bell Hooks, who says that, you know, that queerness is to be at odds, right, with the systems of the world. So when we think about that those are some things that I think we can contextualize regarding our ethical journey and even our humanity, because in many cases we are moving not only into a humanist movement, but I think we are moving sometimes a bit into a human-esque, that we are practicing things that suggest we are human and ideas of what humanity is. And so it is not always rooted in just the necessary wrongs or right, but we have to ask the questions now, what good can come of these things? Because you couldn't smoke weed publicly, now you can, right? That's a new question. What good can come of these things? Is there another question out there? Solomon, let me get that mic for you.
Thank you. I wanted to try and answer, and I also have a question. Beyond what was said up here, and it all seems to wrap in under the same umbrella, is that it has been my experience, and evidence is by everything said, is that human beings are communal creatures. We just do it because there isn't anything that hasn't been described as an enhancement through the exchange of being with other individuals, whether like-minded or not, the exchange of information, the exchange of art, music, just a plethora of things that enhance us as individuals. It seems to me that without that sort of, if you decide that humans are not communal, considering how complicated we exist, then it would seem that the discussion, the thought of ethics becomes moot, other than reproduction. And so that's my response to that question. We just are communal creatures. I had a question that goes back to the trolley problem. And that is that what you said, and maybe I misheard it or something, is that people will often choose, or almost always choose, to take the 3 lives rather than the one. Did I hear that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
No, they almost always take 1 life and to save 3.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right, then I have no question. Yes, okay.
By the way, Philippa Foote is the person who came up with the trolley problem. She was a Cambridge professor and really didn't get her just due until she was fairly old. But there's a book called The Women Are Up to Something. I don't remember the author, but The Women Are Up to Something. It's about how essentially 3 women take over the Cambridge philosophy department. It's a very good book.
I love how Carolyn's head just turned in excitement.
Hi, I'm Louise, and I wanted to speak to your question for a moment. I think that ethics does not exist in a vacuum, and we don't know where we fall short. We don't know where we need to grow without the tension of being in community and bumping up against each other. And that's kind of what I got from reading Adler. And he was saying, like, this is such a sacred, precious place because we don't know what ethical behavior is by ourselves.
Come on.
We have to be in community with one another to learn and grow. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, and what the trolley problem proves, and of course, when Kant was working, again, had very little evolution, so he really didn't know how this happened. And when the transcendentalists in the U.S. were working, they didn't know how this happened. They just were quite sure that it was true. But now we know that it was indeed our communal nature and how we worked together all these years. I mean, a long time to develop ethics, a baseline ethics, and then we can improve upon it. Like, oh, now slavery is not a good idea. We understand that. Oh, now we understand that women aren't second-class citizens or shouldn't be, and so we can update over time.
You know, it's funny, for the trolley problem, we actually, at Susquehanna Valley, we had a board game that we played called The Trolley Problem. And it was really, really fun. There was a really, trust me, we got a little feisty, and you want to talk about the art of arguing. It was a real good argument. I want to go ahead and bring our Zoom family into the room. We've got, I think we have 2 stacked, and just 1? Okay. So I think, Luis, do you still have the mic? Okay. All right. Oh, Kimberly, we're ready for your question, love. Go ahead and unmute if you can.
I'm sorry, who's talking?
This is Dr. J.
What do you mean stack up? I don't understand.
Oh, you're cued to speak. You can.
Oh, okay. Am I interrupting anybody? I don't know.
No. We're ready for your question. David and Terry are here to listen.
I guess the reason we seek out other people is being alone with your thoughts does have its advantages and does have its disadvantages. Disadvantage being you can go down more rabbit holes all the way to Mariana Trench. By coming together and gradually learning about each other's point of view of things, not only does it widen your experience, but also might enable each other to take on some of the pain on our shoulders in order precisely to transform suffering into a kind of learning, into a kind of epiphany by coming together. By willingly taking on some of humanity's pain, we can become more human ourselves and actually do something for humanity as a whole that you can't do by yourself. I'm an artist and I listen to a lot of people, and I pick gun victims and give them away to families, so I listen to a lot of stories, and they're all heart-wrenching. But it pours itself into my work when I give them away. I think that's what I can do. And secondly, personally, at home, I do practice a form of Buddhism, which doesn't have a God. I'm trying to become woke, but woke in a way that I can still be me. I'm a prickly artist who wants to be an enlightened prickly artist, and it isn't what works. I'm not going to get into that too much. But anyway, the second question is, any dealings with Robert Ingersoll by any chance?
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, Ingersoll was a major influence on Unitarians in the late 19th century. I mean, we have the complete Ingersoll in our library down here. He was definitely the person of the late 19th to early 20th century. When I was young, back in the 70s, there were still a lot of people in Unitarian groups who had been big Ingersoll admirers. Those of you who don't know him, he was a late 19th century skeptic, agnostic, the great agnostic, and he spoke everywhere. He got away with it because he was a decorated wounded Union vet. He was died in the wool Republican, but people kind of thought he had to be okay, but there he was, laughing at the Bible and this kind of stuff. He loved doing those, where did the angels find this and that and all of that kind of, those kind of readings in the time. Was there any Ingersoll effect in more than just reading it in ethical culture movement?
Not that I know of.
Not that he knows of, yeah.
Hi, I'm Stan Horowitz from Philadelphia Ethical Society, and I've been, I think, 10 years in the movement through Philly, and I've noticed that proselytization is something ethical culture does really poorly, and I'm wondering how we can fix that. So with that in mind, I ask you, Terry, can you describe ethical culture in a couple of sentences to someone who knows nothing about it? And could it be put on a bumper sticker?
That is a very challenging question because I think if we followed what Adler was saying in those early articles, we'd say We don't pretend to get to the bottom of things. We don't pretend to have discerned the ultimate answers to life's questions. And it's a misunderstanding that that's what we have in common. What we do have in common is a desire to act rightly and to live moral lives. That, I believe, is what animated the early ethical culture movement. Whether that can be the basis for recruiting new members, I don't know. You know, that's a valid question that I don't have the answer to. But I do believe that that's, when I read those early articles, and I know there's some people here who are also reading them, and I'd like to hear what they think. There was a lot of excitement at the time for exactly that kind of organization.
I want to name that we have 5 minutes, so please keep them quaint.
So my question is the idea that it's sort of a transcendental or our aggregate experience that gives us our moral ethical guidance. Does that not absolutely preclude the possibility that there is some fundamental principle? Because our aggregate experience is always growing and changing. So is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, and that's why we need to keep meeting, right? I really do believe in congregational life, and I have to say I would never, ever have participated in any of the ways that we do things here if I hadn't been paid to do it. I am a sit in the basement, and completely secular kind of humanist myself. But what I saw was the good that we could do. Because when I put on a priest's collar when I go to the Capitol. I'm in the religion business. We are in the religion business. We are not destructive. We are leaders in the religion business, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. We're out front because we're thinking for ourselves and we're not dependent upon what the Holy Scripture says. Frederick Douglass taught us to ignore that, right? And we can think for ourselves. But yes, we have to continuously rethink, I think. Yeah.
One of the interesting articles that Adler wrote has an extensive analogy between science and religion, or science and ethics. And he says, the scientist would not be doing science if they didn't think that there's a truth about the questions they raise, but they also realize that they probably have missed the full truth and that it constantly is the new evidence that will cause them to change their mind, or the next generation to change their mind, and maybe even to reject the theories that are currently held. And he says a similar thing about ethics, that we have to assume there is a right and wrong. We wouldn't, and in fact, this is what animates us, but at the same time, we also have to realize that some of the principles that we currently accept are probably wrong and should be revised and will be revised. And both Adler and Sidgwick, when they talk about a spiritual approach to ethics, that's what they mean. Not spiritual in the sense of another realm, but spiritual in the sense of cultivating conscience and always keeping in the forefront of one's mind that one may be wrong even in one's principles, while at the same time realizing we have no option but to act on our principles when we're, because ethics always ultimately is about action, and we act out of imperfect knowledge, but even if we decide our action is to sit and do nothing, that is an ethical action. And so we're always faced with the need to act. Just as I believe science is always taking a stand, even if it's qualified by saying this is the best that we have right now, and there's certain questions we're pretty sure we need more information about before we can make a definitive judgment. But silence is not an option.
Are we going to close out now?
We're going to, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I want to mention a couple of things. Again, about the aggregating. You've heard of Lester Mondale, perhaps, or his half-brother Walter. Lester Mondale was converted to humanism in this very room, which came back to haunt his half-brother, who was accused of being a secular humanist. And as you know, poor Walter lost very badly in that particular election. You may have heard of Sherwin T. Wine, who founded the Humanistic Judaism group, and he began speaking here in this pulpit. So having people listen. The most recent story is about Anthony Penn. Some of you know Anthony Penn's work, a great humanist writer. He came out as a humanist. He was teaching religion at across the river here at the university. He was fired because he came out as an atheist. The minister here called him and said, "Dude, I hear you've been having a lot of trouble. You got fired, and would you come speak to my congregation?" Anthony said, "Well, I'm an atheist." And the minister here said, "I got 400 of them. He'll listen to you." And that then went forward, and now Anthony Penn is the best-known humanist in the world, I suppose. But it was being invited to a place to openly speak his truth that got him on his way. And he's very much a friend. He speaks anytime here that he's in town, and he deeply respects the fact that this congregation was listening. Now, he did say there were a bunch of frozen white people. It was very difficult to talk to, but, the critique is, but yeah. And now we're not quite so bad about that either. So there you go. So congregating is good. The question is, how do we, convince others that it is good for us, I think, but yeah.
So I just want to conclude this session. I'm sure there are so many questions and so many things that we could explore. I will reserve my questions because I can sit with these wonderful scholars later.